This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. If you've watched some, or really any of my videos, these ones, for example, and many more, you've heard me mention Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. And I don't just bring this one up all the time because it's somewhat obscure and makes me seem well-read. It's also fundamental to understanding how, when, and why Tolkien wrote the very particular kind of fantasy that he wrote. It dives into what he considers to be effective fantasy. It addresses and deconstructs a lot of the misconceptions held about fairy tales in Tolkien's day, and it presents an incredibly strong argument for why fairy stories should and must be told. This essay first took shape as a lecture delivered at the University of St. Andrews in March of 1939. It was originally part of a series of lectures delivered at this university annually to celebrate the life and philosophy of its former student, Andrew Lang. Andrew Lang was a Scottish writer and anthropologist, best known for his collection of fairy books, which compiled disparate folklore into really readable compendiums. But Lang was also, as I said, an anthropologist, and he contributed heavily to the 19th century study of folklore, myth, and fairy tales. So when Tolkien, who was actually their third out of 3 picks to deliver this lecture, was approached to give a lecture on Andrew Lang, he chose the subject of fairy stories. This subject had always been close to Tolkien's heart, as he had grown up on a steady diet of myths and fairy tales, but after the publication and success of The Hobbit in 1937, he began to find an increased academic interest in the concept of these fairy stories as their own genre. Through The Hobbit, Tolkien had really begun to dig into the potential of fairy tales as a legitimate art form, and this lecture acts as a very important step in his literary development. When you consider the more traditional and simple fairy tale structure of The Hobbit, and you build onto it the practices and philosophies that he explores in On Fairy Stories, you can almost see the building blocks for the Lord of the Rings epic that was to come. In the expanded and revised edition of On Fairy Stories, Verlin Flieger and Douglas Anderson call On Fairy Stories the pivot point between Tolkien's 2 most famous works. As they say, The Lord of the Rings became the practical application and demonstration of the principles set forth at St. Andrews. I don't necessarily know that I would call this piece concise, although granted, none of Tolkien's works are particularly concise, but it is such a wealth of information for readers, writers, and lovers of the fantasy genre that Tolkien built. And I've got to be completely honest with you guys, I sat here for probably like 10 minutes while trying to write this script, trying to think of how I could elegantly move into an ad transition here. But I've got nothing, so I think that I'm just going to tell you about today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to help you stand out and succeed online. And once you've built your website, you're going to be able to get it discovered fast with Squarespace's integrated SEO tools. Every one of their websites is optimized to be indexed with meta descriptions, an auto-generated sitemap, and more, all things that you need to show up on search engines and bring in more customers. And with Squarespace, it is so easy to monetize your content. You can sell access to online courses, blogs, videos, and memberships. All you have to do is set the price and choose between charging a one-time fee or a subscription. It couldn't be easier. If you're interested in establishing a brand new brand or refreshing an existing one, you should give Squarespace a try. Just go to squarespace.com for a completely free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessOfTheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. Because On Fairy Stories has become such a foundational text for fantasy readers and writers today, I do find it a little bit funny that Tolkien starts off the essay by basically claiming that he's not particularly qualified to deliver this lecture at all, As he explains, although he is an enjoyer of fantasy stories, he has not studied these fairy stories professionally. I have been hardly more than a wandering explorer or trespasser in the land, full of wonder, but not of information. He also gives the important disclaimer that fantasy can be a very delicate thing, and the more that you pick it apart, the more you examine exactly how it works, the more you risk making the magic unable to work on you at all. It's a bit like saying a word out loud so many times that it loses its meaning. But with that dire warning in place, Tolkien dives right into trying to find a definition for fairy story. Something that's a bit of a challenge because at this time, the word fairy story wasn't even in the Oxford English Dictionary. To find this term mentioned, he had to go back to a source from 1750, and the source defined fairy stories as A tale about fairies, or generally a fairy legend with developed senses, B, an unreal or incredible story, and C, a falsehood. Tolkien dismisses the second two definitions as just too generalized to properly analyze. After all, many stories contain unreal elements, and what is incredible is kind of subjective from person to person, and most fiction contains falsehoods. That's kind of the whole point of it. But the first definition, saying that these are tales about fairies, was actually a little bit too specific. Fairies were quite popular at the time, and turn-of-the-century minds had something very specific in mind for them. Long devolved from the great Tuatha of Celtic mythology, or the light and dark elves of Norse mythology, Victorian fairies were small, meek little things. They did mischief in the woods, they drank dewdrops out of buttercups, and they played with children in enchanted mushroom circles. Tolkien found these stories about fairies to be entirely underwhelming. He blamed their minuscule size on people's shrinking creative capacity, the minimizing of their imaginative abilities as we moved into a more modern age. Besides, the definition didn't work on a lot of levels because many things that were called fairy stories weren't about fairies at all. Andrew Lang's fairy books contained very few, if any, and the fairy tales of folklore rarely mentioned them by name. So, in order to settle on a definition of what the fairy story had become, Tolkien coined a new spelling for the familiar term, and he spelled it fairy. And along with this term, he also provided a kind of definition. The definition of a fairy story, what it is or what it should be, does not then depend on any definition or historical account of elf or fairy, but upon the nature of fairy, the perilous realm itself, and the air that blows in that country. I will not attempt to define that, nor to describe it directly. It cannot be done. Fairy cannot be caught in a net of words, for it is one of its qualities to be indescribable, though not imperceptible. So a real fairy tale contains this uncontainable element of fairy. It's a kind of ephemeral enchantment that requires no specific markers like wizards or fairies. It is just the effect produced, this effect of enchantment produced by literature that engages in, well, fairy. Although he can't define fairy super clearly, Tolkien is definitely sure of what fairy stories are not. For example, he rules out satirical travelers' tales or fables about talking beasts, and he especially has a bone to pick with fairy tales that excuse all of the fantasy elements as having taken place in a dream. For example, Alice in Wonderland, where Alice wakes up to find that the fantasy was nothing but her imagination. To Tolkien, this ruins the effect of the fairy story. For it to be a genuinely good fairy story, it has to contain some guise of truth, and those stories simply do not hold to that principle. At this point, Tolkien begins stepping into the potential origins of fairy tales, stories, and myths on the whole. And as I mentioned before, this was a really hot-button issue at this time. Beginning in the 1800s, there was a huge wave of scholarly interest in the origins and meanings of folklore and fairy tales. Scholars like the Brothers Grimm sought to find out where these stories had come from and what they meant about the people that told them. However, this was not a purely scholarly practice, and as is always the case, a good deal of bias was able to creep in, especially into these earlier studies, sometimes, let's just say, to the detriment of their factual integrity. As Verlin Flieger and Douglas Anderson explain, so perturbing were these contents of humanity's ancestral attic that their discoverers were unable to take them at face value, and felt the necessity not just to explain them, but to explain them away. The messier aspects of myth and fairy tale could not really mean what they seemed to mean, so they were reinterpreted. First as metaphors for natural phenomena, then as carryovers without understanding of savage practices from the primitive childhood of humanity. Anthropologist Max Mueller argued that gods and myths were an attempt by early mankind to contextualize natural phenomena, whereas people like Andrew Lang took a more Darwinian approach, seeing these as kind of the leftover echo of a more primitive mankind. But Tolkien disagreed both with the theories that they proposed, but also with just the scholarly practice as a whole. He said that these studies were the pursuit of folklorists or anthropologists. That is, of people using the stories not as they were meant to be used, but as a quarry from which to dig evidence or information about matters in which they are interested. With regard to fairy stories, I feel that it is more interesting, and also, in its way, more difficult, to consider what they are, what they have become for us, and what values the long alchemic process of time have produced in them. Tolkien saw the way that these scholars used stories, as these rich beds from which they could mine history, as misuse. Stories weren't always just metaphors or stand-ins for the real thing. These scholars seemed unable to accept the idea that humans might just spontaneously invent fantasy, that we might intentionally tell stories. And going down this rabbit hole of denying that humans would intentionally tell fantasy, even in the past, in ancient times, we end up with some kind of crackpot theories. For example, Max Mueller's theory attempts to explain that storytelling emerged as a way to contain and contextualize natural phenomena. And that just doesn't necessarily hold up to scrutiny past a point. Tolkien writes, "The gods may derive their color and beauty from the high splendors of nature, but it was man who obtained these for them, abstracted them from sun, moon, and cloud. Their personalities they get direct from him." Thunder and lightning themselves do not have a personality. It's just an entirely natural thing of electrons moving from one place to another. It was humans that assigned a voice and a personality to these natural phenomena. The sound of thunder became a shout, the crack of a hammer, the voice of a god. It is our perceptions that personified nature into gods, not some kind of a natural exchange between the skies and Thor, god of thunder, but an entirely unnatural one, the very human process of inventing stories. Max Mueller once famously called mythology a disease of language, but obviously Tolkien disagrees. As he says, "You might as well say that thinking is a disease of the mind." It is here that Tolkien introduces my personal all-time favorite metaphor. Go ahead and say it with me if you know what I'm about to say. It's the cauldron of story. This is the device that Tolkien uses to explain the process and practice of human storytelling across time as it has intersected with history. Our collective, species-wide imagination and memory is this great simmering cauldron that has been bubbling away through the ages. Every story, every idea, every real historical event is tossed into the pot, broken into its component parts, where these ideas, tropes, characters, and words can be used and reused, told and retold again and again. To explain how this fantastic cauldron works, Tolkien uses the classic example of the banana peel slip. No one, I fancy, would discredit a story that the Archbishop of Canterbury slipped on a banana skin merely because he found that a similar comic mishap had been reported of many people, and especially of elderly gentlemen of dignity. But what of the banana skin? Our business with it really only begins when it has been rejected by historians. It is more useful when it has been thrown away. The historian would be likely to say that the banana skin story became attached to the archbishop. That way of putting it is harmless enough in what is commonly known as history. But is it really a good description of what is going on and has gone on in the history of storymaking? I do not think so. I think it would be nearer to the truth to say that the archbishop became attached to the banana skin. To take the story of the Archbishop of Canterbury slipping on the banana peel and to discard the banana peel and elevate the Archbishop of Canterbury as a verified historical fact is just not academically honest. The oddities and the particularities of the stories that cling to this figure are just as, if not more significant than the existence of the historical figure himself. We can ask questions like, where did this banana peel story originate? Why is it connected to dignified old men? Why do we keep coming back to this story again and again? Why did the Archbishop of Canterbury, of all people, get fitted into this story format? And what can that say about the story format and about him and the way we remember his history? You can't just pull a carrot out of a soup and pretend that's an entire meal. You have to take into consideration the entire soup that it's simmered in. So it is that characters like King Arthur, motifs like dragons and swords, real wars and fictional ones, ideas of loyalty, love, and loss, are recycled and reused through the ages. Storytelling is, or at the very least has not been in a very long time, a process of invention. It is instead reconfiguration. It is dipping our ladle into the cauldron of story, seeing what we can find, and recreating it into something entirely new. But this is not a defect of either storytelling or of history. A proper understanding of the way that the cauldron of history has operated throughout time allows us to understand the interaction between story and history, and how these two things might not necessarily be as different as they seem. From there, Tolkien moves on to discussing the assumptions of scholars like Andrew Lang that fairy stories are written for children. This assumption largely arose from the prevailing concept that children were just like a completely different species than us regular humans, and the idea that the squishiness of their brains somehow makes fairy stories more appropriate for them. And this idea is not only somewhat dehumanizing for children, it also does a great disservice to fairy stories as an art form. When we are teaching children math, we teach them a simpler version, a watered-down version. You start with addition, with counting on your fingers, with multiplication tables. But we teach them a simpler version of math with the understanding that we are going to build on that. As they get older and they become more capable of understanding it, we're going to teach them things like geometry and algebra, all things that we all have definitely continued to use in our real lives as everyday adults. But especially in Tolkien's day, people's understanding and study of fairy stories tended to begin and end in the nursery. You learn of Humpty Dumpty and his great fall, but other than, reading that to another child once you're an adult, it's not likely to come up again. You're not likely to go back and think about how the poem never specifies that Humpty was an egg. Once you get older, it's expected that you're going to move into serious literature, stories about real things. But the problem is that if you move from Humpty Dumpty to War and Peace, you've effectively abandoned your understanding of fairy stories at a primary school level. Besides, despite popular belief, children are not uniquely appreciative of fairy stories. They like fairy tales in, close to the same proportion that adults like fairy tales, because children are generally human, so to speak. But there's also the fact that fairy stories do not require a childlike mind in order for them to be enjoyed. I think that this whole association of children and fairy tales arises from the idea that children are uniquely suited to being able to suspend their disbelief. After all, if you tell a toddler that a troll lives over in the next woods, they haven't had the life experience or seen enough woods to immediately identify that as a falsehood. Children can suspend their disbelief because up to a point, they don't really have any disbelief. When they're really young, they rely on you to tell them information that is factually accurate because they kind of just have to trust your word for it. But adults who have seen the forest and seen that it doesn't contain any trolls, they have to go to a much greater degree of effort in order to suspend their disbelief. But the problem with that is that a really good fairy story shouldn't have to rely on suspension of disbelief in order to compel its readers. You shouldn't have to fool yourself into thinking that something unreal is real just to be able to immerse yourself in fantasy. As Tolkien explains, fairy stories were plainly not primarily concerned with possibility, but with desirability. If they awakened desire, satisfying it while often whetting it unbearably, they succeeded. As a child, I never imagined that the dragon was of the same order as the horse, and that was not solely because I saw horses daily, but never even the footprint of a worm. The dragon had the trademark of fairy written plain upon him. In whatever world he had his being, it was an other world. Fantasy, the making or glimpsing of other worlds, was the heart of the desire of fairy. I desired dragons with a profound desire. Of course, I, in my timid body, did not wish to have them in the neighborhood, intruding my relatively safe world, in which it was, for instance, possible to read stories in peace of mind, free of fear. But the world that contained even the imagination of the dragon Fafnir was richer and more beautiful, at whatever the cost of peril. Children can, and in fact should, engage with and enjoy fairy stories, but that is not because they are uniquely suited to them due to their lack of worldliness. We enjoy fantasy not because we've deluded ourselves into thinking that it's real, but because we have chosen intentionally to engage with something that we understand is unreal. And in a way, that mental exercise is even more suited to the mind of an adult. There is a great deal that can be gained from losing yourself in the realm of fairy, and Tolkien proposes there specifically 4 things you might find: fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. I do find it a bit ironic that Tolkien, who was a philologist, a studier of language, and literally a dictionary writer at one point, that is a man who struggles to find definitions for words. But once again, he finds himself at a loss when trying to define exactly what the practice of fantasy is. But basically, the creation of effective fantasy for Tolkien involved finding a very particular balance between reality and unreality. When you're creating fantasy, you are telling a story that diverges from the, real physical reality around us, but in that diversion from reality, it must be even more grounded in very real logic. If you wanted to tell a story in which the sun shone green instead of yellow, you'd have to apply real logic to that. How do plants grow under a green sun? What do day and night look like? What do the people look like? What is life actually like under a green sun, using the logic of a world without one? Also, yes, for those of you that are about to comment, I am aware that technically the sun is a green star. I learned that last time I talked about this allegory in a video, which by the way is Tolkien's allegory and not mine, which I guess goes to prove that neither of us are astrophysicists, because I didn't know the sun was green, because it looks yellow. How was I supposed to know that? Tolkien takes this moment to tangent into how, because of the delicacy of this real and unreal balance, literature is the best and possibly only way to properly do fantasy. He explains that painting is too technically easy. He says that the hand tends to outrun the mind, and he also refuses to accept that drama, performed storytelling, is an effective way to create fantasy. In the case of drama, he says that because drama necessarily requires at least one layer of suspension of disbelief. You're looking at the man on stage who's a community theater actor and pretending that he is King Oberon, Lord of the Fairies. By imposing another layer of fantasy on top of that, a second layer of suspension of disbelief, the illusion shatters completely, and the fantasy is not effective. Now, as someone who loves the art of drama, I would like to point out that by Tolkien's own logic, he has disproven himself, because fantasy isn't based on believability, it's based on desirability, and the desirability that you have for literary fantasy worlds can be the same desire that you have for dramatic fantasy worlds. However, I think this just goes to show that although Tolkien had incredible ideas and his ideas shaped the modern fantasy genre, no one person is going to agree with every single thing that he said, and I think that's probably for the best. But back to the craft of fantasy, despite its obvious diversion from reality, the thing that makes fantasy good, the thing that keeps it grounded, is a firm footing in reality. Fantasy is a natural human activity. It does not destroy or even insult reason, and it does not blunt the appetite for, nor obscure the perception of scientific verity. On the contrast, the keener and clearer is the reason, the better fantasy it will make. For creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact, but not a slavery to it. So upon logic was founded the nonsense that displays itself in the tales and rhymes of Lewis Carroll. If men really could not distinguish between frogs and men, fairy stories about frog kings would not have arisen. Fantasy is not an ignorance of reality. It is such a rich and complex understanding of reality that the author is able to generate a new one. It's a logically consistent world, one that is so close in line with our own reality, but so outstandingly different. Fantasy has to make sense, or at the very least, like Lewis Carroll, it must be intentionally nonsense. That's where its beauty lies. Another pillar of the fairy story is the idea of recovery, that a fairy story might allow us to reopen our eyes and rediscover the world that's right in front of us. Because, as Tolkien says, fairy stories are so built upon a clear perception of reality, the reading of a fairy story may allow us to engage with the reality around us in an entirely new way. The description of a tree, as told by Tolkien, may very well leave us never looking at trees the same way again. We so fervently desire to engage in this world of fantasy that it may open our eyes to the things around us in our everyday life that are in themselves fantastical. The last two pillars of fairy story go hand in hand, and those are escape and consolation. And Tolkien begins with a very firm defense of the idea of escapist literature. He firmly rebukes anyone that would claim that escapism is cowardly, that it is a weak avoidance of real life. Because, after all, what counts as real life? Is our modern world really that much real life? I mean, we have trains and cars and airplanes and spaceships and artificial light and TVs and phones and the internet, and how is that any more real life than the sun and the clouds and trees? As Tolkien says, fairy stories may invent monsters that fly in the air or dwell in the deep, but at least they do not try to escape from heaven or the sea. But this escape isn't just useful for leisure or relaxation. It can also be a survival tactic. There are other things more grim and terrible to fly from than the noise, stench, ruthlessness, and extravagance of the internal combustion engine. There are hunger, thirst, poverty, pain, sorrow, injustice, death. And even when men are not facing hard things such as these, there are ancient limitations from which fairy stories offer a sort of escape. The old ambitions and desires touching the very roots of fantasy, to which they offer a kind of satisfaction and consolation. This consolation is the ultimate and most beautiful effect of the genuine Tolkienian fairy story. The real world, beyond just being chaotic and overly modern, has things like cruelty, pain, and, for all of us someday, death. Tolkien saw happy endings as essential to the complete fairy story. He coined the term eucatastrophe, which means the opposite of catastrophe. If in a catastrophe, everything falls apart and everything goes bad, in a eucatastrophe, everything comes together and everything turns good. It is a mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, and having a peculiar quality. For Tolkien, the highest purpose of a fairy tale was to evoke this eucatastrophe. You can see this just by looking at The Lord of the Rings. Everything seems aimed towards failure. Sauron's victory looms over them, and Frodo personally fails at that pivotal moment, but just when it seems that everything is going to collapse, it all goes right. There is loss, there is pain, there is death, but it all goes right in a way that you just so rarely see in the real world. Of course, Tolkien believed that fairy tales were not the only place where this eucatastrophe was possible. As a devout Catholic, he saw the eucatastrophic fairy tale as an echo of the great eucatastrophe of salvation history, of God's plan for his people and his eventual return to make everything right. Tolkien concludes his essay, "All tales may come true, and yet, at the last redeemed, they may be as like and unlike the forms that we give them, as man, finally redeemed, will be like and unlike the fallen that we know." On Fairy Stories is a meandering essay, and it has been critiqued for being unfocused, which, I'll be entirely honest, it absolutely is, but I kind of love it for that. After all, this was originally not an essay, but a lecture. And if you take into account the reports from people talking about Tolkien's lecturing, speaking, and possibly even thinking style, this essay kind of feels like what having a conversation with him may have felt like. Because although it is meandering, and although it's not super focused, it is so rich in these complex philosophical ideas that he puts them more beautifully than anyone else could have put them. But especially looking back on this essay with hindsight, you can really see how the ideas of this essay were embodied by The Lord of the Rings. As Tom Shippey puts it, his beliefs about language and about mythology were sometimes original and sometimes extreme, but never irrational, and he was able to express them perfectly clearly. In the end, he decided to express them not through abstract argument, but by demonstration. And the success of the demonstration has gone a long way to showing that he did often have a point. The Lord of the Rings is the practical demonstration of Tolkien's on fairy stories. And whether or not people are even aware that this essay exists, the rules that were laid out by it are the rules that are still observed, played with, and broken by the modern fantasy genre. I'm not exaggerating when I say that reading this essay altered my brain chemistry. I think it was the first non-Lord of the Rings Tolkien piece of writing that I ever read, and it was one of the first scholarly essays about storytelling that I had ever read. And it has shaped so much of how I read, think about, and talk about storytelling as a craft. And whether or not people have read this essay, I think that it has had a similar impact on the way that they think about this stuff. Although this essay is relatively obscure, I think the mere fact that it has become the accepted practice for storytelling, and especially fantasy storytelling today, it really beautifully proves the points that Tolkien was making. The idea of considering both history and storytelling to be important in the development of humankind, the idea of fantasy as its own real genre, and not just a childlike fancy. All of these ideas are rooted in Tolkien, and in one way or another, on fairy stories. He was right. And although Tolkien is unfortunately not around today to see what beautiful works have emerged from the wellspring of story that he guided us to, I do like to think that he would be proud to see his thoughts on fairy stories so beautifully realized. If you are a lover or even just consumer of fantasy media and you haven't read this essay, just go read it. This video is not an acceptable substitute for actually reading the incredible words that Tolkien wrote, because there's a lot that I couldn't get to in this video, and this is just one interpretation of a work that honestly could have thousands of interpretations. But still, I am so glad that I could sit here and put some of my thoughts about this essay all in one place. I really mean it when I say that this piece of writing is very important to the way that I think, and it's so important to me that I get to sit here and share these ideas with you guys. However, I do not love that I have to share these stories with you through the weird barrier that is the internet. But this coming October, there is an opportunity for both you and I to engage in Tolkien's stories in a very in-person way. I am very excited to share with you guys about the Brandywine Festival, which is taking place this October. It is an immersive Hobbit-themed live-action roleplay happening in a lovely little part of Kentucky, where there's going to be food, festivities, storytelling, games, music, and just a whole range of hobbity delights. I'm definitely going to be there, and if you would like to either join me there or get a little bit more information about this event, the Kickstarter is linked in the description. Frankly, I'm so excited about this event, and if you talk to anyone who's known me for the last 10 years, you would know that this is literally a dream come true. I have talked about an event like this happening for so long, and I'm very excited. Just a heads up, there will not be a new video next week because the last video in April is going to be a huge project that I've been working on since the beginning of November, and I need a week to get myself on track with that and get that video made. So that's going to be out next week, and I'm super excited to have that video out for you guys. If you want to stay tuned for that one, consider subscribing if you're not already and joining our lovely little community, and do consider giving this video a like. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy Hobbity day.